Great. Thank you so much to everyone that's joining us today as part of the Second International Conference on Policy Diffusion and Development Cooperation. Today we are turning to panel 6 to present work related to the theme of Beyond Coercion, Emulation, Competition, and Learning, the frontiers of causal mechanisms in research on social policy diffusion. So let me share a few slides with you to introduce the participants in this panel and also the presentations that we'll have today, and then I'll turn it over to our presenters. So just one moment, bear with me here. All right. Okay. We're still getting used to this new online format, so I'm going to rely on my sort of co-leader of this panel, Johanna Coleman. So Johanna, if there seem to be problems with the screen sharing or any issues, please feel free to message me bilaterally, and then we'll sort out any problems, I'm sure, as we go. And many thanks to the conference organizers for helping us to transition to this new online format. I know it would have been nice to all meet together in person in Brazil. It certainly would have been nicer weather, I'm sure, than where I am now here in Italy. But we're doing our best with the online formats. And thanks to everyone for making this transition during COVID and being here with us today. So like I said, this is the first session for panel 6 with the title on the screen. And I'll go ahead and move to the next slide. So we have 6 participants in this panel, and it's going to take place over 2 sessions. But I'd like to introduce just very briefly all of the panel participants. So first we have Karina Stange from Calandrin from Universidad de Sagrado Corazon, I believe. I believe that translates as Sacred Heart, if I'm correct. Karina, I'm sure when you present today, you can correct me. Apologies for the pronunciation errors. And then we also have several people from the University of Bremen, Johanna Coleman and myself, who helped to organize this panel. Connie Son. We also have Stephen Devereaux from the Institute of Development Studies, and then Anna Volkenauer, also from the University of Bremen. And like I said, we'll be splitting these panels and papers over 2 different sessions. So today is the first session. So our first paper will be on causal mechanisms in the analysis of transnational social policy dynamics, evidence from the Global South, presented by Johanna Coleman, and she's written this paper in collaboration with her colleague Tobias Tenbrink, but he unfortunately could not be with us today. And then we'll have paper 2, which is on political and social psychology and decision-making processes, an analysis of Israeli politics by Karina Stange Calandrin. So with that, I will stop sharing and turn it over to Johanna for the first presentation. Just to give you a sense of how the session will move forward, Johanna and also Karina will give a brief 10 to 15 minute presentation of their paper. As the discussant, I'll offer a few comments and questions for them to engage with, and then we'd happily take any questions from those watching the panel, and we'll try to respond to those as well. So we'll move through that with Johanna first, and then turn to Karina, and we'll probably finish a bit early, somewhere just over the hour mark, we predict, but it of course depends on how many questions we have and how much engagement. So thanks to everyone. I'm going to stop screen sharing from here and turn it over to Johanna.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present our research here. And also I would like to thank again the organizers and especially Osmani for the huge efforts he and his team have made to bringing this online format together. The paper that I'm going to present today will be the introductory chapter to a special issue that I'm co-editing with Tobias Tenbrink and which is forthcoming in Social Policy and Administration. The special issue includes research that was conducted within the Collaborative Research Center Global Dynamics of Social Policy at the University of Bremen, and I really look forward to receiving your questions and comments on this issue. Okay, so let me share the screen. Okay, I hope you can see it. So for some time now, the field of social policy research has been seeing a growing number of studies on welfare arrangements in the Global South. And within this, it has been acknowledged that transnational factors play a key role in explaining social policy dynamics in these regions. With regard to early social policy, different forms of typically European imperialism have left strong legacies in their respective colonies, and other factors include wars, economic dependencies, growing trade and capital movements, nation-states bound by the rules of international organizations, transnational migration, and also the exchange of ideas and norms. However, these interdependencies changed throughout the years, but they did not disappear. And especially since the 1990s, authors have observed the introduction of state-led social policies in the Global South that cannot be fully understood purely in terms of national policymaking. And these developments also reflect close interdependencies with other countries as well as other international organizations. And what we want to analyze in this special issue that are the transnational dynamics of social policy, which take various forms. They include, for example, horizontal exchanges between nation states and their societies, as well as vertical relationships between nation states and IOs, which in turn reflect different power relations. And in terms of the outcomes of these transnational social policy dynamics, one key finding in the literature is that welfare states do not converge. Rather, and this is also written here on the slides, a wide array of national, regional, and sub-regional welfare settings prevails. And we argue in this special issue that these discrepancies should be explored by taking into account both transnational dynamics and national and local development patterns. And we study these dynamics by focusing on the causal mechanisms that are at play. So the main research question that we aim to address in this special issue is which causal mechanisms can capture the transnational dynamics of social policy in the Global South. And as I said already, this is the introductory chapter to this special issue. So it gives a rather broad overview and summarizes some general findings. Generally, how to arrive at an explanation of a social phenomenon is a fundamental question in all the social sciences, of course. And importantly, existing approaches have often been found to be inadequate to fulfill this task, including correlational approaches, but also covering law models. In fact, more and more social scientists now share the view that in order to explain, we must really look for causal mechanisms and we must try to find evidence for causal mechanisms. Recent decades have also seen a growing literature on mechanisms and on mechanism-based explanations, and this focus on mechanisms developed in very diverse research traditions such as critical realism, analytical Marxism, or analytical sociology. And also, historical and political sociology and political science have dealt with causal mechanisms. However, in political science, it's important to note that the whole causal mechanism debate often centers around methodological debates. And here, causal mechanisms are promoted as a way to overcome the perceived weaknesses of both quantitative approaches and qualitative research, the latter often being criticized as, storytelling and not being able to provide any causal explanation. Yet, it is very contested how to exactly define a causal mechanism. What is generally acknowledged is that the key feature of mechanism-based approaches is a clear focus on the process between X and Y, between causes and outcomes. And one definition, for example, by Beach and Patterson states that mechanisms are not causes, but are causal processes that are triggered by causes and that link them with outcomes in a productive relationship. So in a nutshell, mechanisms tell us how things happen. In order to be able to understand what's in a causal mechanism, to really unpack causal mechanisms, it's necessary to develop a detailed understanding of the crucial elements of a process that occurred between the cause and the outcome, and also the causal relationship between different elements. And moreover, it's also, of course, very important to understand the context within which the mechanisms unfold, which is why much research, especially in political science, has focused on the concept of process tracing, or on process tracing as the most suitable method for identifying causal mechanisms in real-world cases. So that's the general approach that we're going to use in this special issue. And the next question now, of course, is how exactly can we then study causal mechanisms? Generally, there are different approaches which are suitable for analyzing the role of causal mechanisms when it comes to transnational social policy dynamics. And in this whole context, research on policy diffusion features very prominently. The typology, which I think most of you know very well, is this typology of 4 diffusion mechanisms, namely competition, emulation, learning, and coercion. However, in research practice, it has been shown that there are, in fact, several difficulties with these typologies. And many scholars have also pointed out that these mechanisms require further analytical refinement, especially when it comes to their explanatory power. So, in fact, given that the analysis of diffusion mechanisms is mostly based on large N studies, it often remains rather general and abstract, and therefore falls short when it comes to providing profound insights into how processes of diffusion exactly unfold. Against this background, the approaches that were found to be more suitable for analyzing transnational social policy dynamics in our special issue were first the policy transfer and lesson drawing literature, which you can see here. This strand of research developed relatively independently of the policy diffusion literature and mostly uses small N samples to study in detail how policies changed. It also provides in-depth analyses of how processes of transnational influence unfold by highlighting ideas and policies and by focusing on the role of actors in these processes. Second, studies used theoretical frameworks that were derived from the field of public policy analyses. Most approaches were originally designed to capture national policy making, but they are also suitable for analyzing transnational social policy dynamics. Examples here include the multiple streams framework and the actor-centered institutionalism. And third, in this special issue, we have found the policy design literature to be very useful. Here, causal mechanisms have been used to show how policymakers can design effective policies. And finally, there are, of course, also approaches that glean causal mechanisms from inductive empirical research. However, these identified mechanisms do not evolve in a theoretical vacuum either, but are inspired by existing concepts, which often are rooted in public policy analysis as well, such as epistemic communities or policy entrepreneurs. So in this presentation, I will not present the findings of all the individual articles. This would be far too much for this format, but I will only briefly illuminate some overall findings, which of course have to remain a little bit general and broad, given the introductory character of the paper that I'm presenting today. First, when it comes to the empirics, it can be stated that explanations of social policy making in the Global South remain incomplete unless transnational factors are taken into account. These can take various forms. They can, for example, include international norms, policies from other countries that are perceived as successful, and the role of transnational actors, particularly IOs. However, this does not mean that national factors are no longer important. Instead, what our findings strongly suggest is that when it comes to actual social policy decision-making, national institutional settings and actors are key. Thus, to acquire a really thorough understanding of social policy dynamics requires us to take the domestic level seriously. Importantly, also, a clear-cut dichotomy between transnational and national factors is highly problematic because national actors are often deeply embedded in transnational policy networks or in epistemic communities. And against this background, distinguishing between national and transnational actors can become extremely difficult in empirical research. So future research needs to pay careful attention to the interplay and reciprocity of national and transnational dynamics when it comes to explaining social policy dynamics. On a more conceptual level, it can then be said that mechanism-based approaches are well suited for analyzing social policy dynamics, not only from a plurality of perspectives, but also in both single case studies and in comparative studies. So what all articles in this issue clearly illustrate is how analyzing causal mechanisms allows for a detailed depiction of causally relevant steps of social policy processes, thereby highlighting the key actors that are involved, as well as their activities and their interactions. And by making use of mechanism-based research, we can trace the interplay between transnational and national actors and also its impact on shaping social policy outcomes. A possible contribution to pave the way for more generalization and also for more comparability suggests that distinguishing between mechanisms at different stages of the policy process can be very helpful. First, at the perception and translation stage, the focus is on mechanisms that explain how national actors acknowledge international interdependence, acquire new knowledge of social policies from abroad, and then translate these into their own social policy legacies. And second, we have the cooperation and conflict stage, where the emphasis is on mechanisms that explain how social policy proposals are negotiated in the national arena. And third, at the collective decision-making stage, the analysis is centered on mechanisms that explain how the actual decision to develop a social policy proposal takes place. And finally, these stages can, of course, also be complemented with a fourth stage, namely the policy implementation stage, which highlights the actors and dynamics that are at play when policies are put into practice. Moreover, that's a final point here, it's important to stress that the output of social policy making is, of course, highly complex, and it can often not be explained by a single mechanism. So rather than examining the combination and possible interaction of several causal mechanisms becomes key, which can provide more in-depth explanations. Okay, so to conclude, I would like to very briefly highlight some possible future research areas that should be addressed and that we were unfortunately unable to address in this issue and also in the paper. So first, while much research on social policy making in the Global South has focused on the role of transnational influences when it comes to introducing social policies, more research is definitely needed on the question to what extent these factors also shape the inclusion or exclusion of different groups, as well as the generosity of social benefits. And second, what we found is that the role of informality and also of discrepancies between social policy in practice and on paper needs to be much more investigated. A final point concerns the role of regime types in social policy making. While the history and expansion of the welfare state has often been portrayed as being closely linked to liberal democracy, the articles in our special issue remind us clearly that the relationship between democracy and the welfare state is less clear-cut, and the question of whether and how exactly social policy and political regimes are connected, and of course also which causal mechanisms can explain the transnational dynamics that might be at play there, should feature prominently on the agenda of future research. Okay, that was it. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Johanna, for the presentation. It was really helpful and a very swift and solid overview of the paper. So thank you so much. I can see one question from the comments box from Catherine Zardes, I believe, and she was asking again, Johanna, in what journal the special issue will come out in. You said Social Policy and Administration, is that correct? Are you with us, Johanna?
Yeah, that's correct. Social Policy and Administration.
Okay, great. Thanks. I just wanted to, that are with us here. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much again for the paper, Johanna. My comments are relatively few because it's clearly a very polished paper that's already sort of ready to go out to introduce a whole special issue. So I'm sure there's already a lot of thought that's gone into it, and it's very well developed. So I have relatively few comments. I really only had a couple of questions I wanted to ask you a bit more about. I think first is this idea of kind of transnational actor constellations. and the role that they play in causal mechanisms, I guess, and how you think of them. Because I guess one question I have is sort of how you conceptualize actors as part of the mechanism. Are they just sort of entities in it, or are there things that go on inside actors, both as individuals perhaps, but also as organizations, that themselves might be mechanisms, and how you link that together? You mentioned the notion of a causal chain also in the paper at one point, and I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that and these kind of broader conceptions of mechanisms as well. There was one other question that I had for you in relation to the really interesting comment on informality. I was wondering if you could just say a bit more about that and how that might play a role in the way in which we think of causal mechanisms, because I wouldn't have assumed that would have been at all excluded. But if there's a reason to bring it more into the analysis, or reasons why it's not coming in formally, I'd be really curious to know a bit more about that, particularly when it comes to engaging in contexts in the Global South, and we know that informal institutions and processes are critical and determinants sometimes of welfare outcomes or provision in various ways. It's a key area to engage with. So if you could say a bit more about that, I'd be really curious to know. And finally, I guess, I think one thing for me that a lot of the work on causal mechanisms has raised is it's given us, as your paper and also Karina's to come highlights, and it's kind of opened up what many call a black box, how causal factors might affect policy outputs or outcomes. And I guess I'm wondering, from your view, what the work on causal mechanisms might bring to a sort of more complex notion of a policy process. I mean, so often, even still in policy practice, we deal with policy processes that are very linear, the kind of 4-stage policy cycle ideas. And I think when you look at policymaking from the view of causal mechanisms or process tracing or much more in-depth views, we tend to get a much more complicated real picture, I think, of what's going on there. So if you had any sort of particular critiques of the policy process model, the very simple sort of linear one that really hit home for you from all the work you've done on causal mechanisms, I'd just be really curious to hear, the progress that we could make there in practice from that view. So Johanna, I'll give you a chance to respond to just those few, I guess, questions and comments to further the discussion a bit. And then after that, for those of you who are with us online, please send in comments and questions to the comment bar on YouTube. And then after Johanna responds, I'll be sure to post those questions to her. Thanks, and I'll turn it over to Johanna.
Hello, and thank you, Johanna. I'll just share my screen, just a second, and I'll start my presentation. Okay, thank you for the organization committee on the second International Conference on Policy Diffusion and Developed Cooperation for the opportunity for me to be here. And I'll start to present my paper and my research that was based based on my dissertation, my master's dissertation research on political and social psychology in decision-making process and analysis of Israeli politics. Right now, I'm a PhD candidate at the São Paulo State University, Unesp, here in Brazil, and I'm also professor at Universidade do Sagrado Coração, Unisagrado, also in Brazil. So my research wanted to propose a discussion on the formulation of foreign policy in Israel from the point of view of the responsible institutions and bureaucracies. Foreign policy decision-making process can be understood as a complex arrangement between institutions and bureaucracies responsible for decision-making, and I would like to discuss this process in Israeli politics and discussing a little bit about the importance of social and political psychology in this analysis in international relations. In Brazil, we don't have a lot of analysis regarding political and social psychology and the discussion of foreign policy analysis. I know that in Europe and United States, it's a huge and complex field of research, but in Brazil, we don't have a lot of papers and researches regarding this topic. So the central argument here in my research deals with how the decisions are taken by the Israeli government regarding especially security and the conflict with the Arabs and the Palestinians specifically, in which the pragmatism of decision-making would be overestimated, since emotions would have a central role in the decision-making process. We wanted to highlight which actors are responsible for decision-making regarding the bureaucratic model analysis developed by Allison and Zelikow, and theories of political and social psychology. As I said, in international relations, especially in the realistic and structural realistic theories, it's assumed that the state is the only actor in the international system, and the decision-making is centralized. So the states are the only actors in the international arena, and the decision-making is very centralized and it's really easy to understand how the states acts regarding especially security, and ends up generating a superficial analysis, in my view, because it does not consider a fundamental point that decision-making is not carried out by a single rational individual, and by rational, I mean pragmatic, but by numerous actors belonging to diverse institutions that have their own decision-making process and their own agenda. In addition to their own perception and interest, making all the guidelines of foreign policy the product of a complex and dynamic bargaining process. These models, such as realistic theories in international relations, have formed the backbone of international relations theory, and they are not criticized as much, especially in Brazil, regarding political and social psychology. The paradigms related to these theories assume that individuals mostly don't matter in the outcome of political events. But what we try to discuss in this paper is that they have a huge impact, especially their worldviews and the collective memory and the conflict ethos regarding Israeli and Palestinian conflict. Political psychology, as I said, on the other hand, have a lot of interest in what happens inside the small black box regarding decision making, the measures input and output, stimulus, response, and what guides the process. For political and social psychology, what is more interesting is how the decision was achieved and then the actual content of the decision itself. Not only psychological models attribute greater complexity to humans, they differ from rational models. And once again, rational, I mean pragmatic in international relations theory, and many other ways as well. Another difference is related to the concern about a liberal polarization. So in the traditional view in international relations theory, polarization and political parties, for example, don't have much influence in decision-making process regarding foreign policy. And what we could observe from studying political and social psychology approaches, it's the other way around. They have a lot of influence. So regarding specifically Israeli politics, the dominant belief, not only in politics, but in the society in general, that almost all national problems are security problems. Of course, from if we consider the traditional theories in international security, is already the most important issue in the country's agenda, in all of the countries. But what we wanted to discuss in this paper, it is the security problems and the importance of security in Israeli agenda. It's not determined by it's part of a complex memory regarding aspects that are best explained by social and political psychology theories. So as a result, every major crisis at the beginning of Israel's history was a threat to national security and personal survival. Such subordination of all particular and collective aspects of life to security requirements was typical of the second generation of immigration, but it is still present until this day. So in terms of the decision-making, the security concern led to the development of a decision-making mechanism that relies more on the operating agencies of the military and security establishment, such as the Ministry of Defense, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, and, for example, the intelligence services as Mossad. So we have a system that reinforce the choice of bureaucratic analysis theory to understand the Israeli decision-making process. We have to comprehend how these institutions and bureaucracies can intervene in decision-making process regarding foreign policy. So rather than on the work of those involved in policy making, leading to ad hoc solutions to immediate problems and short-term policy options that do not always fit together to constitute a long-term policy. So in politics and in the Israeli society, and the politicians are part of the society, this is very, very important to understand, because in the international relations traditional theories such as realism and liberalism, the politicians are seen as outside, as part of an elite that it's outside, is not part of the society. So they are not influenced by what the society thinks and what the public opinion thinks in general. But it's not the case when we analyze Israeli politics and all countries' policies from the view of political and social psychology theories. Because in Israel specifically, the society and the politicians would be conditioned to believe that there is a real, tangible, immediate, and existential threat, both to the collective security of Israel, as I state, but also to individual citizens, especially the Israeli Jews. We mainly address the political differences in Israel, as well as their translation in relation to political parties that are very, very important to understand the decision-making process. So, despite the polarization in Israeli society, security remains a dominant in the Israeli ethos that has chosen to privilege personal security and well-being for nothing less than the survival of the state. In fact, as the years goes by, and Israel strengthens itself as a state, security is still the thing that stands out as the main determinant that affects and influences virtually all spheres of public life in the country. And to understand how security is still the main topic on the country's agenda, we have to understand the psychological elements that are present in Israeli society, such as emotions, especially fear, and how the politicians deal with these emotions, and the politicians are part of the society, so they experience the same emotions, and especially the collective memory of the conflict. So the wars with the Arab states, the persecution of Jews during the 20th century are also elements that have a huge influence in Israeli society and how the decision making has occurred during all these years. So to conclude with what we found during the research is that the decision making process in Israeli foreign policy is especially is formulated from numerous groups that have security as a paramount on the government agenda, but which have disagreements about the paths to be followed and how to maintain security. The structured nature of the decision-making process with a multi-party parliamentary political system leading to the need for a coalition to govern, besides reflecting a highly polarized society, increases the difficulty of instituting public policies and making the emotional aspects the elements that would unite the different groups of government and the population. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward for your comments and questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Karina, for your presentation. I'll add just a few comments, and then I think for both you and Johanna, we'll go ahead and let both of you reply and also bring in comments from the comment bar. So just to get us started, let me see just a few things. First of all, I think thanks so much for the paper. And one of the lines that really stood out to me was you said in the paper, I think it was on page 11, you used I'm paraphrasing, but you said something to the effect of thinking of security as the absence of fear. And for me, that really hit home the extent to which emotions play a role in this. And it's implicit in a lot of the language we use in foreign policy, and coming from sort of more of an American background, clearly myself, the notion of kind of hearts and minds and playing off both of these things in foreign policy, particularly in a security context, has been longstanding, I know, in US foreign policy and other areas. And obviously, linked to this notion of fear is also, as you point out in the paper, issues to do with threat identification, perception of those threats by various actors, and their magnitude, and even threat construction and the role of narrative in deciding sort of what's important along those lines. My comments in the paper are more to do with its kind of construction and the way that you build this argument and sort of put some sort of, I guess, the strategy you might use really to analyze this case. And I wonder if going forward, it might help you to position Israel as a kind of most likely case, or perhaps even a most extreme case, in order to start identifying how emotions systematically affect foreign policy making. Because I think you might have a case for that, and packaging it that way as a research design might help to sort of leverage your findings a bit more, and bring that through more strongly to the reader, I think is one possible suggestion. And the paper on the whole, I also think you could maybe take a bit more of a sort of broad and interdisciplinary look at the role of emotions in the social sciences, because I completely agree that it's been marginalized, and I think it's excellent that you're bringing it into this work. I know there's a somewhat developed literature on the sociology of emotions, and I think that's sort of having a bit of a revival. So that might be one area to look into. I know you also, in the title of the paper as well, wanted to focus on social psychology in particular in this literature, and largely on the institutional level, but I think on the individual level, but you also rightly brought in issues at the national level, or to do with institutions on a larger scale, that I think are also really important. So maybe just clarifying lines, or kind of unpacking that discussion and rearranging it a little bit, might make it a bit more clear to the reader a tiny bit. I also think there's interesting literature on the role of narrative in policy formation. And another thing that jumped out to me strongly in your paper was the notion of an enemy, and constructing the idea of who is an enemy, what is an external threat. And I think in the social policy literature, we oftentimes talk about processes of othering, but usually that discussion is in a domestic policy context. It's very much to do usually with poverty, deprivation, these kinds of ideas, and constructing the quote other. But I wonder if the kind of construction of an enemy and the construction of an external threat of any kind, and the narratives and ideas that we use to do that, I think are also really interesting to me. And I think you have some really great themes to develop along those lines in the paper, which is very exciting. My only other final question, I think, and comment really for you is also, when we talk about transnational social policy dynamics, I'd be very curious to hear from you the extent to which you think we need to make key distinctions between the domestic policy sphere and the foreign policy sphere, to make that sort of bifurcation, if you will, because you talked about how implicit security concerns are to the Israeli case into policy making throughout its policy making, and I can see exactly how that could be the case. But I wonder sort of if from this one case you have any particular comments on if or when you think it's critical to make a distinction between the domestic and the foreign policy spheres, and why that might be, because I think that gets skipped when we start looking transnationally occasionally, and I'm interested in that thing myself in sort of my own work. So those are the comments from my side. Perhaps we can turn it over to Johanna. Johanna, are you back with us? Because I think she got disconnected before. And then I'll turn it over to Karina for you to respond to some of those issues, and then we can move to the comments that are coming in from everyone that's with us today remotely. Johanna, are you there? Yes or no? If not, we can turn back to Karina for now and come back to Johanna whenever she's with us.
Okay, yeah, I was somehow disconnected from the studio right after my presentation, but yeah, now I'm back. I hope that the internet connection keeps going. Thank you so much for your comments. Also, Connie, thank you for your additional comments they are really very helpful in further strengthening this paper, and I will very briefly try to address all of the comments, both yours, Amanda's, and then Connie. So first, The question on informal aspects or on the informality of social policies, of course, very, very interesting. And I would love to tell you more about that, but unfortunately, it was not really the focus in this special issue. So there we really focused on social policy expansion on the policy level. And then we realized, okay, so the whole picture needs some, needs a closer look at the implementation level, but I can give you, some ideas what might be important there. I mean, of course, the causes on the exact role of informal factors, it depends. It's, of course, an empirical question. But I mean, sometimes it's really like policies do not really fit. We often have the case that contribution-based systems are introduced and there are highly informal labor markets. That is of course a problem, and then also there's often low trust in the system, or sometimes systems are just relatively new, and then it's kind of normal that they do not immediately work well. I mean, we have these in all we have this in all countries. So in any case, there are interesting gaps, and they need to be addressed more. Then Amanda, your second question regarding the policy cycle. I mean, of course, the policy cycle is a heuristic, and it's the policy cycle by itself cannot really explain anything. So if we want to understand social policy dynamics, if we want to understand what's going on within different stages of the policy cycle, we do, of course, need additional theoretical framework. And then it's another debate to what extent existing theoretical frameworks can help us to really, explain. And I think here introducing mechanisms to these different stages can, in fact, be very helpful. Also a great question on the role of actors. I mean, in our special issue, we mostly think of actors as entities, but mechanisms can be used on many different levels. And of course, there might also be collective actors, and it is possible to analyze the role of mechanisms, for example, of decision mechanisms within collective actors. And I mean, also Carina has said that in her presentation, pointing to the role of psychological mechanisms, of emotional mechanisms. This already points to the fact that we can also focus on mechanisms, decision-making mechanisms on the individual level. So mechanisms can really be scaled to a lot of different aspects, but in our special issue, we mostly focus on collective actors as entities. Okay, I hope this addresses some of your questions and comments. Thanks so much for taking the time of reading through the paper and giving me their comments. They are very helpful, and we will include them. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Johanna. I'll turn it directly over to Carina then. And Carina, if you can see the comments that were addressed to you in the comment bar as well, feel free to address those too at the same time if you like, but the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Amanda, for your comments and time reading my paper. I totally agree with your comments. It's really hard to connect processes regarding internal and external policies. And regarding Israel specifically, there's a saying that said that Israel has no foreign policy, only a domestic policy. Of course, he was saying about the importance of security in foreign policy. That is also an issue. So it's hard to separate internal and external processes regarding Israeli foreign policy. But I have always studied Israel. That's why the paper approaches Israeli foreign policy. But I want to extend my research discussing decision-making process with the mechanisms from social and political psychology, and discuss Brazilian policies, for example, Brazilian decision-making policies, especially right now, and other countries using the same theoretical scheme to understand these processes. So thank you very much once again, and I hope we could extend our discussion in our next half hour. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks, Karina. And Karina, also, there's a question for you. I can see, in addition to congratulations on a wonderful presentation, there's a question for you in the comment bar. Did you get a chance to see that? And would you like to respond to it before we close, unless there are any further questions from those that are with us today? I can read it if you can't see it.
Sure, I can't see it.
Okay, sure. So the question reads, in your opinion, what is the weight of cultural habits in the decision-making process in Israel?
So it is very important because we have to consider the construction of Israeli state. So we have to consider Zionism. We have to consider the different Jewish communities that formed the Israeli state. So we have the Ashkenazi, so Jews from the Central Europe, especially Germany and Austria, Poland, and we have the Jewish community, the Sephardic, that are the Jewish community from Portugal, Spain, and north of Africa. And we have the Mizraim, that are the Jews from the Arab countries, and we have the Ethiopian Jews. So we have a lot of Jewish communities, different Jewish communities that formed the Israeli state. Of course, I forgot, we have the Russian, they have the Russians, we have the Jewish community from Russia that was really important, especially after the end of the Cold War. So Israeli society is what we can call as melting pot. So it is a lot of different communities, and we have to consider the non-Jewish society in the Bedouins. We have a lot of communities, the Christians. So we have the Arabs, Christians, and Muslims. So it is a huge society, a complex society, and the cultural backgrounds from these communities have influence in decision making and have influence in Israeli politics. That's why the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, is a multi-party system. So we have a lot of parties, considering that Israel is a small country with a small population, for example, comparing to Brazil. And we have a lot of parties with different perspectives regarding the conflict with the Palestinians, regarding economics, regarding education, regarding infrastructure. So it's a lot of different backgrounds that are in Israeli society today, and it is important to understand all this cultural background and their experiences during the conflict, regarding the Jews, especially the Ashkenazis, regarding the Holocaust, and all of these experiences formed the collective memory in Israeli society, and the collective memory has a lot of influence in decision-making process.
Great, thanks so much, Karina. We don't have any more further questions coming through in the comment bar, so I think for today, this is probably where we will close. If I can manage to share my screen one more time, I can give you an overview of the presentations that we'll have next week. So bear with me just one moment. There might be kind of a slight delay, but let me see if I can do one final share with everyone, and then hopefully you can join us again next week, which would be great. So let me try to do a little screen sharing here. All right, again, I'm going to rely on my sort of co-panelists, here to see if there are any problems, but I'm going to assume that you can go ahead and see the screen now. But again, thanks so much for joining us for this first session. Session 2 will be held next Friday, the 12th of February, again from 14 to 16 GMT, and we'll have 3 papers next week. One on British colonial development assistance, again, trying to return to these themes of coercion, emulation, learning, or competition by myself, Amanda Schreiwise. A 4th paper on the influence of ILO conventions on the historical development of maternity leave policy in the world from 1884 until 2018 by Connie Son. And a 5th paper on the double translation of social protection policy from agencies to agents to actors, given by Stephen Devereaux and Anna Volkenauer. So with that, I will stop sharing right now. And we'd like to thank you all for joining us, and we hope that you can return to join us again next week. Also, I think probably in the conference program, there are at least names and institutional details, if not emails. So if you were unable to join us or watching this video at a later date, please feel free to email anyone presenting today, and we can continue to connect remotely as we make it through COVID, since we can't meet together. But thanks again, like Johanna said at the beginning, to Osmani and all the conference organizers, and we look forward to being with you again next week. Thanks. Ciao.